From FingerLakes1.com and WGCC Geneva Community Radio, this is The Debrief. I'm Josh Durso, joined by my co-host, Jackie Augustine. It is a hazy, hot, and humid week up here in upstate New York, which probably means we're going to be talking about power later on. But first, we have to talk about Geneva City Council. There was a meeting Wednesday night. Great starting point because we got a mix of fiscal stuff with community building stuff and economic development. Jackie, you were there and you actually spoke. So I guess before we get into the nitty gritty here, let's start with the overview. What stood out to you from the meeting last night?
Well, I will say, and maybe I can chalk this up to the heat, although they were doing their best to keep the room cool last night. It did seem like a bit of a financial discussion meltdown in the meeting, because, the city council is trying very hard to wrap their head around how the budget works, where city council might have some flexibility in moving the needle on things like revenues or expenses, trying to understand and tease out revenues that are taxes versus revenues that might be fees or revenues that might come from state aid or other sources. And the staff, again, I feel like I always have to say something nice about the staff because sometimes no one else is. But, the staff is doing a yeoman's job of getting them really complete information in the most both granular and digestible way, because I think they understand, like, okay, this is the council we're dealing with. Like, we've got to put the information in a format, both visually and then in their actual explanation of it, that is kind of easier for the group to understand and follow. And I'd like to say, because I'm trying to turn over a new leaf and kind of emphasize more of the positive, that there really was an attempt to ask questions that would be clarifying and to think about things. But as you know, the staff is working within this constraint that the council has indicated that they do not want a tax levy increase this year, which is not a tax rate stabilization. Right. It's a tax levy stabilization. It's still not entirely clear to me that they understand the difference and the consequences of that, because then you also had a counselor read into the record basically an opinion piece about police funding being constrained by all these budgetary considerations. And I'm thinking, right, like those are the things you just voted on at the last meeting. And now, so I think they're still trying to figure out how what they do leads to what happens.
Yeah, it's interesting because they seem to have a better idea now than they did a month or two ago about where the revenues are, what they are. However, when it comes to how to cover the gap, and I guess this is something I should ask you before we go any further into this, is it completely clear what the exact gap will be, or is it still sort of a speculative?
Yeah, I mean, I do think as they're getting more refined numbers from periodic sales tax collection, from the state aid, which moves from projection to reality at a somewhat slow pace, I think that each meeting gets us a little more fine-tuned into what the gap might be, but there's no getting around the large structural issues, right? Salaries, retirement, which still, I think, on the books, they don't necessarily see in its full entirety in terms of what the long-term budgetary impact is, right? They look at, oh, this year, this is our retirement contribution. But I think they're still coming to terms with the fact that decisions they make right now personnel that they carry right now will continue to impact the city's budget for decades to come. That I think is still a little blurry. Um, and I think is space where I expect the comptroller and the acting city manager will now be spending more time trying to explain to them what the gap really looks like and what the magnitude of those pressures really pencils out as.
So as the financial discussion unfolded last night, the reason why I asked that question is because there were a laundry list of ideas floated, from some of them seemed pretty well thought out, like they had been some consideration had been put into them individually. And then others just seemed like kind of ideas that may have just come to mind as they were sitting there. I wanted to go through some of them and just kind of like talk a little bit about and get your thoughts on some of these. Um, and also like, so I'm just going to name a couple of them off the list that I made. Um, there was the idea that fees and permits, fees for various permits could be expanded. Okay, sensible-ish, I guess. Although I'm not sure that would work depending on the magnitude of the gap. Rental permits, inspections, meaning eventually going to fines, I'm assuming, increased fining. If you're going to follow that all the way through. Parking permits, I believe parking permits were also something that was kind of
Right.
discussed. Um, Before we go into any of the other stuff, I just want to say, like, if the city all of a sudden has a dozen new permits that cost, even if they're very small amounts of money, um, to the average resident who's interacting with those permits, it's going to feel the same as a tax increase. Like
Right.
it's you're literally like just taking you're moving the pile of stones from one to the next, and you're not actually changing anything at all. You still have the same amount of stuff in front of you. Um, Also, bicycle registration, which
Okay.
I texted you when I saw that because I was like, bicycle registration. That is a part of my brain was like, okay, I get it. But also, like, if you're talking extensively about the missed opportunity, if we're going to call it a missed opportunity, to enforce your existing stuff, how would this be enforced?
Uh,
I mean,
okay,
how many
let's just
bicycles are there in
address
Geneva?
I know. Let's just address the bikes and set it aside because again, there was a lot of and maybe I bear responsibility for this because as you said, I did go to the podium and I was reading off some city code stuff because the first thing when it used to be when you joined council, the first thing you got was the city charter, thin document, and the huge city code, big document. And I'm a nerd. I read that stuff. I like it. Now it's much easier. It's online, right? But I still remember some of it. So I had come to the podium to talk about a couple things from the code, which we can set aside. Then a counselor, toward the end of the meeting, as you're saying, reached way back into like chapter 86 of the code to say, you know what? We're actually supposed to be licensing bicycles, and this is a revenue generating source with all the bicycles now and in the e-bikes. I would just point out the bicycle registration requires the city clerk to log a bike to issue a bike license plate, which must be displayed on the bike and destroyed when it changes hands. And the annual fee for that, for all that effort, 25 cents. I don't think we can 25 cents our way out of a multi-million dollar budget issue. And I'm sure the counselor did not mean it to be such a silly throwaway idea, but it was a little disheartening because it went hand in hand with and really the solution is industry, as if no one had thought of that. B, no one, we were turning it away, right? I mean, all the industry knocking down our door. If only we said yes, things would be solved. Like, that's just not the way things work. And also, we've seen over time the only industries that have approached Geneva in recent years have been industries we don't want because they would pollute our air and water to such a significant extent that people may not want or might not be able to live here. So I don't think that, you know, poisoning our neighbors and then nickel and diming them or quartering them, which that has a different connotation, but is going to fix it. So we can kind of set the bikes aside. But to the fines and fees and permits in general, as the acting city manager said, it's one thing as a policy statement to say we ought to make sure that the services we provide, that we're recouping the fee that we incur for those services, right? If I have to send code enforcement out 4 times because you're non-compliant, I want to make sure that the fine you're being assessed for being non-compliant is at least covering the staff time that you're taking up. There's a lot of things. This is when we did our nuisance party ordinance, which I will never live down when people called me the party pooper counselor, right? The idea was if you have a house that is repeatedly generating police and fire complaints, you ought to be assessed a fine that recoups some of the costs from the city for dispatching those services over and over again. That, from a policy perspective, makes sense to me. The idea that we should just up fees as a way of offsetting our commitment to keeping taxes where they are doesn't seem like a good idea. Because, like you said, it's the old political shell game where we say we've done this, but really we're recouping it in a way that feels exactly the same to the people who are living here and actually kind of shifts the burden in some cases to the people least able to pay, people who don't have driveways, people who need to ride bikes. The idea that they should be making up the gap and not the community as a whole doesn't seem particularly equitable or logical.
I think code enforcement on rentals was also mentioned at some point during the debate, if we're going to call it that, or conversation. And I would just like to say, speaking from experience watching this kind of uh, thought process play out in other cities, um, the trouble is when you get into enforcement, if you are going to be more aggressive with enforcing uh, any kind of code enforcement stuff with rental units, and you do have absentee landlords involved, and I believe that's the lane that this was sort of getting fit into.
Yes.
You run the risk of really putting the people who live in those places in jeopardy. And from the housing standpoint, there's the equity issue that's involved in that, and how it really just affects the people who are least able, like you said, to deal with the consequences. Um, but also, none of the fixes are going to be able to. A lot of the fixes will not be able to happen in a fast enough amount of time. And what you can or often do see when enforcement gets more rigorous is you actually see a greater pinch in the housing market because you still have the same number of units or less units because all of a sudden rental units are coming offline instead of actually being, just immediately made 100% perfect. Um, so that's just one of those things where I think it would be great if every city, if every community really took code enforcement seriously when it comes to rental properties. But unfortunately, it really requires more than just a council opinion, even just a council resolution or statement that we're going to do this. Like it really, I think communities have to approach that really carefully and have to have a really comprehensive plan to how they're going to approach it, because that can spin out of control really fast.
Yes, and I think the first stop in all these discussions is to really think things through, and you can't have a knee-jerk reaction to these very complicated issues because, again, and I will try to make my next column a positive set of suggestions for how they might approach this differently. And I'm getting it I'm getting it from both sides here, right? Like I've got people who are like, "Oh, you're too negative and they're not going to do what you say because you're being mean to them." And then I've got other people saying, "Don't give them your ideas, like make them do some work themselves." I do not take any ownership over any of these ideas. These are just things that have happened, that have been suggested to happen, that should happen, and I don't care who does them, who gets credit for them. I just want Geneva to improve. And if that means I have to say it with a sunnier tone, I'll do it that way. But I think the first thing, and this might have been the quote of the night in my view. You might have thought it was the bike licenses. That was, but the quote of the night, in my view, was a counselor who said, "Look it, when I first got elected, my main thing was figuring out code enforcement and fixing it. And now I'm looking into it many years later, right?" And this is my concern. If something is your top priority, make it your top priority. Be- Become as much of a specialist in it as you possibly can. Learn about it, research it, look at what other communities are doing. And instead, we have this very passive approach where it's like, "Hey, someone ought to do something about this. I want it fixed." And then when staff says, "Here's what it would take to fix it," the answer is, "Well, not that. No, that's not what I meant. No, figure it out a different way." And it's like there's no value given to expertise or experience. So instead, we just get caught, like you were saying, in the same conversations other communities keep having and keep not being able to solve because they think it's simple and it's actually complex. And when they talk about let's reinstate inspections for 1 and 2 family units, I agree with that. I was on council when we had to roll that back. And it wasn't because we didn't think the houses should be inspected. It's because we couldn't afford the legal fees for sending somebody, you need to have an attorney, going to court representing the city for each step along the way in this process, because we have a lot of non-compliant units. Everyone understands that. And for us to forcefully enforce, which I believe we should, will require an investment. But that investment is going to have to come from somewhere. And when you have a group that refuses to rein in any cost drivers, they can't afford to add new stuff. So they need to admit what their priorities really are. And unfortunately, when it comes to the budget, I think we're seeing the priorities are political. Say you're holding the line on taxes, say you're not cutting anything from public safety, say you're getting tough on things, but if we look at what's actually going to happen, there won't be movement on the things that they claim are their priorities because they aren't funding their priorities.
Yeah, and I would just like to add, it was now three plus years ago. I was having a conversation with someone who worked in code enforcement in another community, not in Ontario County, and I kind of threw that. We were just going back and forth about what would 100% compliance look like when it comes to long-term rentals, and he was like, honestly, you'd probably be talking about 40 to 45% of the long-term rental units in any community that would instantly be on the no-fly list and would have to have work done. And obviously, not all of that would be work that would require, families to move out or tenants to move out of those units. But when you're talking about that much of your housing stock being uh, basically not 100% compliant with your rules, you got to take another route to getting compliance back, and it takes time and it's complicated. Rentals, I thought it was really interesting because there seemed to be this like back and forth throughout that whole conversation. Everyone kind of like not saying it out loud, but reckoning with the reality that you've got short-term rentals, you've got long-term rentals, and between both of them, you have code enforcement issues. And it even doesn't seem completely clear that the city has a firm idea of what they have in terms of each
Right.
of those. Taking the permitting side of it out of the equation, I do hope that Geneva gets that more under control because it will make these types of conversations that they have internally a lot easier to have, because it's hard to talk about, well, what could this permit in long-term rentals or short-term rentals generate for us if we don't have an exact number
Right.
to work with.
And
Um,
again, it's slightly frustrating to attend the meetings and hear everything old is new again, meaning a lot of this work on the short-term rental registry, fees, etc., was done several years ago and then pulled back, right? So for example, the zombie property ordinance, the short-term rental registry, the short-term rental again fee and kind of inspection protocol, all of those things were put forward about 2 councils ago, not me. Again, this isn't about whose idea it was, but these were things that were put forward and passed, and then for political reasons, pulled back from, and now they're being reintroduced as new ideas. The problem is the data that shaped those policies has shifted, so there needs to be at least a check to make sure that the strategy that was aimed at before is still going to fit the reality of today. And in most cases, it probably will, but it's a little concerning that they don't want to take the first step. And I'm not
right.
suggesting a study or consultant. I'm just saying they need to show more understanding of the actual issue and the landscape that they're trying to shape.
Yeah, it's complicated, and none of it is, again, it just goes back to this theme that we keep coming to, which is, as much as everyone would like these things to be very simple, here's this one thing, we're going to pass one resolution and the problem is solved. It's all complicated, complex stuff that requires a whole bunch of different hands moving in the same direction to get traction. Let's talk about something that I think you brought up, and then it kind of bubbled up into a potential revenue driver: abandoned construction fines. So a project that starts, stalls out, someone doesn't ultimately follow through, or maybe they're really slow for one reason or another. Um, I thought it was interesting because this is one of those areas where I wish more communities uh, were stricter on. And I know I just got done saying you can't be, really stern and strict with code enforcement on rental units, because you'll have you'll create a new housing crisis. But this is one of those areas where you can, because it's not yet realized. It's not physical. It's not there. Um, you know, Communities should hold developers to account, and the goal should be to get the projects done as quickly as possible so that they can be to the community's benefit. But these projects, and we've seen them in every zip code. I'm not just talking about Geneva. We have seen them in every community across the Finger Lakes. They'll start, there's lots of excitement, there's a few press releases, and then 6 months later, it's just kind of stalled out and it's not moving. A year later, year and a half later, and then, sometimes you fast forward a couple of years and all of a sudden, just sort of it becomes known to the community, oh yeah, that's not actually going forward. They pulled out. So I think that's one of the areas. I thought it was nice that that was getting some attention. I don't know how seriously Geneva is about, going in on that. What would you get? What was your sense of that whole thing?
Well, I mean, I need to say, I didn't necessarily raise it as like a serious, substantial revenue suggestion. I was pointing out that they do have tools in the toolbox to try to, as you're saying, hold developers to account. In other situations, my recommendation has been a performance bond, which they're reluctant to do. They think it's insulting to developers. They think it shows we don't have faith or trust in what they're going to do. In another situation, it was host agreements for things like the landfill, or when Guardian was given a renewal of its pilot agreement, the idea that they should have to contribute to community environmental justice pool of money for our hosting of their emissions. So these tools that would happen at the front end of a project or front end of an approval. I mean, Guardian's been going on forever, but if they're going to come back and they want another 30-year pilot agreement, it seems like that's a point where we have some leverage. But if you don't do that from the beginning, that doesn't mean you've lost all ability to have any input, guidance, oversight, accountability in a project at all. It's not just, oh, well, that didn't work out, and I guess we'll just wait and see what they do with that site. The former Legion property, there are many tools at the city's disposal for moving that project out of the hands of a private entity, which is, I think, the long-term goal, or transferring it to a private entity who actually moves forward with it, a compelling, positive project. And I think part of it is capacity, right? The city does not have right now dedicated staff. They have dedicated staff. They do not have staff dedicated to looking at this kind of big picture enforcement question and making sure that the city standards are being, you know, upheld in all circumstances, right? That would be a more robust planning and economic development department, but we've not seen the investments in that department that are needed. Losing David West, losing Katie Labby before him, you know, were huge, and we've not backfilled those gaps. So I think I was trying to encourage the council to take seriously their ability to set as a policy that staff ought to look at ways to kind of hold these projects like this to account. And again, it's an old part of the code. The daily fine is $250. That's not really going to, you know, put anybody out of business. Not that I'm trying to do that, but the point is that it signals that Geneva actually has some standards that we expect promises to be kept, that we're willing to work with people, but we're not willing to be abandoned in that way, and that we're not going to say, as has become the company line, well, at least we're getting something where before we were getting nothing, you know, because the Legion was tax exempt and we're getting some nominal tax payment from the holding of this property now. I just want Geneva to like care about itself a little more, right? To care about us a little more, the powers that be, and to say we actually deserve better treatment than this, and we have mechanisms for making sure that things move forward. And if you're not the right person to develop this project, we'll find somebody else who is.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where, again, it requires zooming out, and it requires a little more than just we're going to do this resolution from a governing body. It requires some real collaborative work. It's interesting. Public hearing looks like it's going to be happening in August on 555 South Exchange, which was sort of part of the broader discussion at the meeting last night. To demolish or not to demolish, that is the question. It's really interesting to me because this is I've seen these in plenty of towns and villages across the Finger Lakes over the years. The governing body always ends up having this conversation when it's to this point. I can't remember who it was that mentioned it, but someone said that there were like large cracks in the walls of this building. Like, it literally sounds like the building is falling apart. So I'm not really sure what there would be to save. But it's one of these scenarios where communities should be keeping really close tabs. If you're not going to do the code enforcing part, at least keep a really close eye on what looks like it's heading into oh no territory. We want to keep as many buildings as possible out of oh no territory, because it sounds like that's where this structure is, and whether it can be saved or not, who knows. There are so many awesome programs. I think of like the 5 to Revive every year from the Landmark Society. There are so many preservation grants out there to get, but very few of them will work well if a building is already essentially falling in on itself, right? Like you kind of need to be like a couple of years away from that point. So after I listened to that part of the conversation, I thought it was just interesting because this is a really good example of communities just needing to be a little more proactive with this kind of stuff. And just, if you're an elected official, you should know where the 10 or 15 quote unquote worst properties are
Right.
in your community, because I'm sure you're getting emails and text messages and calls and all that sort of stuff from neighbors and things like that for a whole array of different reasons. But keep those front of mind and try to find a path forward for them before they get to this stage. Not every
Well,
property owner is going to want to work with the city or with the town or the village, but I'm just saying, in most cases, I think being proactive wins out over letting buildings just get to this point of who knows what we can do or if we can save it.
I agree with you in principle. I think the issue in Geneva is slightly different in this case. Um, there are many downtown buildings that have been identified over the years as needing intervention. Uh, some of them owned by the same people, some of them owned by different people. But interestingly enough, the city has been able to act swiftly in demolishing, selling, condemning some properties in some neighborhoods. But when it comes to downtown, there does seem to be a willingness to overlook or not take on certain property owners. And then things get to a point where then it falls on the city taxpayers to foot the bill to actually affect the demolition of a building. And what's unfortunate about that, in addition to the fact that we shouldn't have to pay for other people's problems, is that it it really shows the misunderstanding about city council's role in safeguarding its key assets. Our downtown is a key asset. And the fact that multiple city councils would be willing to look the other way as properties that staff recommended time and time again for action were let go until they get to the point of no return means that there's a different motive than actually the city's best interest. And that is cause for concern for me because everybody should be treated fairly in the city. And that means if you're on a board or you know people or whatever, you're subject to the same rules. And if you pose a threat to the livelihood, the vitality, the prosperity of a neighborhood, a community, then that's the thing, right? Like when I am delinquent in not shoveling my sidewalk, I get a citation. Right. And I don't complain about it. Like, I understand that's how it is, right? I was out of town and that didn't get done. And that was my responsibility. But we have property owners who, when the zombie property and the abandonment by neglect ordinances 10, 12 years ago were being put through and passed, these properties were on the list of top billing to get in there before they got to the point of no return. And council chose not to take that action. And now here we are. And I understand that they say, well, we'll assess the cost against the taxes. The city will not recoup the investment it's going to take to do what they think they have to do, which is demolish. And that's why my position, I know people are going to think it was solely born of preservation. It's not, that's not my main concern. My main concern is that fiscally it's irresponsible for the city to demolish that building at this point. It should exhaust all legal remedies to force transfer of that property or the owner of that property to do what's necessary to make that not a public threat. And it's worth noting, people were living in it just short order ago. So I understand that we've got a lot of like eyeball engineers who are saying, like, I saw a crack and it's falling apart. And I don't deny it's in bad shape. I've been in the building. I'm not an engineer, but it looked bad to me, right? But I do think we're not leveraging the range of assets and opportunities for a historic structure that the city chose to allow to decay. And I just find that irresponsible.
Yeah, I mean, and it goes without saying. I think we both probably would agree on this one. Um, the cheapest option is the one that should be the option that's like, obviously, if there's a 0% chance the city is going to be able to recoup demolition, then the rehabilitation option or forcing the owner to be accountable is the one that should be pursued. Um, but I was speaking more from the zoomed out, you know, message to all other communities across the Finger Lakes and upstate New York for that matter. Be proactive with this stuff. Stay on top of it because
Yeah.
it can get away
Keep an
from
eye
you.
on your neighborhoods.
Yeah. And the other thing too is that people don't realize is like, cuz I'd been doing a little just searching on Facebook about the property and listening to people talk about how the structure had decayed. Um it really seems like if there is a lot of decay that had happened recently, it happened in a relatively short window. So again, just going, and I'm not saying any of it is concrete or fact. I'm just saying, you know, you can forget about a property like this for a year or a year and a half, and a lot can go wrong in that amount of time
And
for the property in terms of its integrity. So that's just kind of the thing where, like, requiring, 3-month updates from property owners on if there are certain properties that are in really bad shape and the community knows they are in really bad shape, requiring periodic updates from property owners doesn't seem like the worst idea in the world. I've seen some communities actually move forward with that kind of approach. It's more work, it's more administrative work. Obviously, property owners don't love it, but yeah, just one of the things you have to do to try and stay accountable. Let's shift gears here and talk a little bit about energy. So there was a massive long, wordy report that came out a couple days ago from the state's independent system operator, which said New York's grid is headed into a tighter, more complicated period, and there isn't going to be one simple fix. This comes on the heels of another report about 3.5 weeks ago that said uh, the state was basically going to be facing a double spike calendar. So it used to be summer was the most intense, difficult time for the grid to keep itself up and running and healthy. Now, actually, that's going to be happening in the winter as well. So two spikes throughout the year that really stress the grid. This new report, though, is interesting because it made a few things really clear. One, that demand is rising because of electrification. It's also rising because of data centers, and it's rising
right.
because of manufacturing. And I think all three of those are interesting because we don't hear about the data centers enough, in my opinion. The
Hmm.
electrification thing is kind of back of mind for people now because you're seeing more electric cars and stuff on the road, but they're kind of becoming just commonplace. You see them all the time. And then manufacturing, of course, is interesting to me because all we ever hear in any space from almost anyone is that manufacturing is dead. Well, guess guess not. That must not be true. So those three things are all stressing the grid, while the state is also trying to retire or reduce fossil fuel generation and bring new clean energy online, which obviously isn't happening as quickly as anyone wants it to. Just is so much. I'm guessing you didn't have time to read all 80 something pages of that draft report. It's a draft report too. I should clarify that it's not a final report. It is just a draft report. If you're interested in reading it, it's the 2025 to 2026 to 2044 forecast report. And it's fun. It's interesting.
Yes, I'm sorry to disappoint you because despite my professed love of documents that I can, regulatory documents especially, that I can sink my teeth into, only had time to read the executive summary of that report. But I mean, this is something you have been consistently on and on top of, and it's great because we need more people talking about this. Because again, this is, I mean, like our last discussion, right? Like, how can the state, regional economic development councils, local governments, whomever, every resident not understand, especially in the heat wave, right? Where we're all probably relying at least a little bit on our air conditioning. I rarely turn mine on, but this week for the dogs, I had to. Um, I think I think the idea that reliable power is a necessary public good um, seems to always get pushed aside by other competing priorities. And it's hard not to understand why that wouldn't, like, again, you got to keep your house in order. So, in the same way that I was just saying, city council should be keeping an eye on downtown and key buildings, the state as a whole, uh, the nation as a whole, I think, should be keeping track and tabs on power transmission um, and understanding that people are going to need that. It's just, the way things are. And maybe we don't allow and permit and expand large load users when we don't think we can cover the existing load users in a reasonable and reliable way.
Yeah, so just a couple quick notes that just popped into my head from what you just mentioned. If we're talking full zero emission uh, uh, source for the state, we need 105 new gigawatts of power, 30 to 60 for the kind of rolled back uh, scale where there's still some carbon element involved. That's a lot. Like that, I know those numbers don't sound like a lot, but that is a lot when you're talking about bringing new power online because there isn't really any like immediate fast way to do it. And the other thing that was in this report that I thought was really interesting, it it absolutely hammered on transmission as much as it talked about, needing so much more power. Like the state literally needs to generate more power. It also just hammered the point that, there are two regions, the Central East region and the Northern New York region, that transmission is a huge issue. And even outside of those regions where, like here in the Finger Lakes, transmission is the biggest issue. It's the most expensive thing to improve, to fix, to update. And as it stands right now, the power companies just are not incentivized or even required, for that matter, to meaningfully invest in transmission so that power can actually get from A to B. Because we can easily be in a scenario where by 2035, there's more than enough generation, but we may not be able to get it from A to B because the trouble with this work is right now there's a rate case that's being debated or being discussed. It's my guess is it's probably going to be approved by the state and everyone's rates are going to go up, and that's fine. But all of the work that's inside of this current rate
Is it
case,
fine? No, sorry.
even if it is
It is what
fine,
it is. Right.
like even if it's all greenlit and every single project gets to happen, it's not going to be done for 3 or 4 years. And guess what's going to happen in that amount of time? It's going to keep going, right? Like the demand and the load and the requirement is going to be greater. So you're going to not even actually take any meaningful steps forward in that process, even as everyone's bills increase and projects happen. It's really complicated. Like, because even just getting the actual physical things that are used for these transmission upgrades takes 12, 24, 36 months sometimes, which
Right.
puts which turns your construction timeline into a complete nightmare when you're talking about a grid that is like every day getting closer and closer to the brink. I for me, the blunt takeaway from the report was pretty much that the state needs to hold the power companies and everyone involved accountable, whether they're large load users, whether it's the companies that are ultimately responsible for uh, maintaining and executing our energy supply. Um, Everyone needs to be held accountable, and some of the most intense, extreme, and expensive, frankly, investment anyone has ever seen has to happen. Otherwise, rolling blackouts are just going to be a thing that everyone has to deal with and just has to accept. And I don't really you know, I don't really see a way out of that. And not to sound like a complete downer.
I don't I again, let me come to your defense as not calling you a Debbie Downer, because I feel like just saying what the reality is and helping people to contextualize and prepare for that reality doesn't make, like, don't blame the messenger, right? Like, we're just saying how, like, again, with my critique of city council, like, sorry, I'm just calling it like I see it. Um, so I think when you're talking about, the transmission problem, it is it is the reality. It is what needs to be addressed. And I don't think that you're giving us a chicken little scenario where the sky's falling and it's not really. Like, by their own admission, by their own predicted rolling blackouts, like, the sky is going to fall and we need to do
Yeah.
something about it. And I think what we've seen, and maybe this is the through line between some of the things we've been talking about today, is that transmission is a fundamental systemic issue. It's complex. It needs attention. It requires serious thinkers trying to figure it out. What we're getting from some of the actual, NICEAG, RG&E, the Avangrid affiliates, and some economic development people who would rather just like to see more capacity built with nuclear or whatever, because they've got some skin in the game, right? They want those projects to go forward. What they're saying is, hey, why don't we solve this problem by having people use gas stoves instead of electric? And to me, that's the same thing as trying to solve the city's problems with a bike license. Like, it's just not getting to the core issue. So I appreciate you bringing this up and continuing to talk about this, because it needs to be front and center. We need a more comprehensive solution to this.
Yeah, and the last story I wanted to talk about is essentially a carryover, which was in the Times Union this morning, the Albany Times Union, I should say. The Champlain Hudson Power Express. It's a transmission line that brings hydropower from Quebec down into New York. Went offline this week, literally right as the heat wave was starting. Like, it went offline, and it's a 339-mile, $6 billion transmission line that you know, supplies or is supposed to supply roughly 20% of New York City's overall power needs. Um, it just went offline. Like, it just, large power users had to cut back on Wednesday, and that was sort of the response. And everyone was like, oh my God, how did this happen? It doesn't really matter, right? Like, if the system is so fragile, if our overall power system is so fragile that one blink and 20% of your power source, your overall power is gone, or, you have rolling blackouts through certain parts of the state, or whatever the case may be. You have not done a good job of holding the people who manage these systems accountable, and you got to do something different. It's interesting because I listen to people all the time bash green energy, any kind of new green energy. Even if we were to say, we're going to greenlight every single solar, wind, any project under the sun for the next 4 to 5 years, transmission would almost certainly be the thing that prevents us from realizing maybe any of that benefit. Like, we are so behind the eight ball when it comes to transmission in New York State that the power itself is just it's part of it. It's not all of it.
I think you're making good sense and helping people to understand where they need to be paying attention, because I think sometimes these issues are so big that people don't know how to start thinking about them. They don't know where to really dig in. They don't know how or what they should say to their elected officials, to the regulators. And, I do think there's a lot of power in educating people about what the reality is and what needs to change for it not to be the dire prediction that we're all fearing.
Yeah, and one last point on this. So often when we talk about power and potential for rolling blackouts and all this kind of stuff, people think of air conditioning in the summer and they think of heat in the winter. What doesn't get talked about or thought of nearly enough is the refrigerator and everything that goes bad in there. And for large families, and especially for families that are counting every penny, counting every dollar, replacing everything that's inside that fridge, not easy, especially with the price of literally everything today. So just one of the things to think about, and we'll be talking more about power next week and probably every week thereafter, because as we just said, it doesn't really seem like anything's changing in the short term. But hey, that'll do it for this week's show. We will be back next week. And in the meantime, be sure to subscribe to the FingerLakes1.com YouTube channel for more live local content all week long. Thanks again to everyone listening over at Geneva Community Radio. For Jackie Augustine, I'm Josh Durso. We hope everyone has a great week.